Jonathan Clements here, back for episode 3, which begins with a triumph of storytelling and also of cheap animation as we juxtapose the gobbledygook of Amano's prize-winning physics speech with the flirtations of her karaoke performance alongside Coach Ota, cunningly eating up 90 seconds of running time with what amounts to a scrolling credit. Believe it or not, Otoko to Onna no Love Game is a real song, which, because of its duet nature and its playful flirting, soon became a karaoke staple. The original version was relatively recent when Gunbuster was made. It was made in 1986 and was a duet, but originally only the chorus existed because it was a jingle in an advert for Takeda Pharmaceuticals gastrointestinal medicine. But the song became so popular that it was pimped up into a proper song release, and there were in fact several different duos competing to release it, including one that was only released in its native Nagoya region and another that went national. So as a result, according to Jazzrack, it was the third most popular song in Japan in the year 1987, so it's a nice little temporal touch for it to be thought of as a golden oldie 2 generations later, when Kazumi Amano and Coach sing it to each other. But of course, by singing a duet, they are also suggesting, however obliquely, that they are becoming a couple. But we've already segued into the title song, and since we're on the subject of music, I might as well talk a little bit about this as well. Active Heart is sung by Noriko Sakai, a teenage idol singer only a couple of years into her career at the time Gunbuster was made. And she was another one of those fan favourites, a singer who also drew her own manga series and did all kinds of weird stunts like opening a souvenir shop halfway up Mount Fuji. There was some talk early on of her taking on the role of Noriko in Gunbuster as well, but that didn't happen. In fact, her career in Japan foundered a little bit in the late 1980s, and she achieved an odd overseas boost by focusing really quite heavily on the Taiwanese market, where she arguably had a bigger fandom in the early 1990s. She came back to Japan and found true fame on television in the mid-1990s with her role in Under One Roof, but it's then that she had, only then, that she had her first million-selling single and achieved true star status in Japan. In subsequent years, she had something of a run-in with the law, which I'm not going to talk about on this commentary track, but you're welcome to Google, leading me to make another comment about this track worth repeating at this point. I am relatively free to say whatever I want about Gunbuster, but the opinions shared on this commentary track are my own and do not reflect the opinions of the show's distributors in Japan or America or anywhere else. And I should also add that there are some topics I've been politely asked not to talk about, which I'm honouring in these recordings. The Gunbuster Collection book draws the viewer's attention to the fact that Noriko appears to be calling out to Kimiko instead of writing her a letter or an email or something, and suggests that this is a vestige of a forgotten subplot that was going to have them being able to communicate telepathically in real time, like something out of Robert Heinlein. However, it seems that although Noriko is prepared to give telepathy a try, Kimiko doesn't really pay much attention to her and doesn't notice here. There's a payoff in episode 6, but we'll get to that at the time. In fact, as the story goes on, we discover that Kimiko, like many other people back on Earth, has done her best not to think about the conflict underway thousands of light years away in deep space and not to let it trouble her. This is the very beginning of the moratorium subplot in which Noriko remains a perpetual teenager while her childhood friends grow up and move on. What Noriko doesn't say is why everybody is confined to their quarters during a warp, which is liable to be for the facility that offers for cordoning off areas of the ship in hermetically sealed units, so if there is a hull breach or some other incident, the loss of life will be reduced. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but this is a long story, so probably worth starting now so we can fit it in. And that involves the origin of the character of Smith Torin, whom Noriko will shortly be meeting. In the Gunbuster world, he is a handsome American pilot from Texas who is the titular first love in this episode, helps Noriko grow up a little bit, and then, spoiler warning, dies horribly on their first battle sortie. But in the real world, he is based, however obliquely, on a real person who was a friend of mine and who was comically aghast at what Gainax had done with his name and his image. Torin Smith, for that was his real name, was actually Canadian, and when he died about 10 years ago, I was surprised how few people in anime and manga fandom had heard of him. Because in the 1980s, he was a pivotal figure in bringing manga to the United States and hence the world, and he would shuttle backwards and forwards between Tokyo and San Francisco, taking those no-luggage options available to FedEx couriers. And over time, he and his future wife, Tomoko Saito, would become the founders and leading lights of Studio Proteus, the manga company that brought Ghost in the Shell, Appleseed, and many other titles to the English-speaking world. But in those early days, he was very, very poor, and I remember him telling me there was one point in his Japan days when he was practically starving and reduced to shoplifting instant noodles from a 7-Eleven. And it was at that point that his friends from fandom stepped in. And Toshio Okada, who had met him at a Japanese science fiction convention, offered to let him stay at the Gainax house. Now, the Gainax house was a rental dormitory that Gainax were using to put up many of their animators, and it was notoriously dirty. There were rows and rows of bunk beds and trash that was never taken out, terrible smells and mould in the kitchen, and Torin ended up living in a room that was actually a walk-in closet they'd put a bed in. And during the time that he was there, the people of Gainax were working on Gunbuster and decided they needed a handsome love interest. And as the days went by, the animators would come up to Torin and show him this figure developing on the page, and they would say to him, "This guy is you!" And he never quite knew what they meant until he turned up in the show. So when Smith and Noriko are sent out to polish the laser lenses, they're going to be clad in surprisingly retro-looking spacesuits that will have a design viewers may recognise from The Wings of Oniamis, Gainax's earlier science fiction movie. The same type of design would also be recycled again a few years later in Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water. As for Torin Smith, Torin would actually lend his voice to Gunbuster as well, his real voice. Both he and Tomoko have little cameo roles as deck officers panicking later in the show. And to be honest, I've never been able to identify which of the voices is Torin. His accent in Japanese was quite noticeable, so I would recognise him, I think, if he had more than just a couple of words to say. But his name switched into Japanese order as a result of some confusion. I mean, what kind of name is Torin anyway? Would remain immortalised in the story of Gunbuster evermore. And it is funny to think, actually, that it's been 10 years since he died, tragically very young, and really this is probably the only thing he's going to be remembered for, because his work in manga has all been sold on to other companies. Now, there was a time in my life when I would have regarded the sight of a captain of a ship indulging in a sushi buffet as some sort of ludicrous in-joke. But in recent years, I have enjoyed the privilege of being a guest lecturer on a very well-known ship that hires academics to come aboard and keep the residents happy. And when I went up to the bridge, I was a little bit surprised to see the captain and first officers were being very well treated by the cooks. So maybe it's not so weird after all. It does, of course, accentuate just how Japanese the future of Gunbuster is, with Americans and Soviets being reduced to walk-on roles, while the rest of the main roles are being filled by Japanese characters. Sushi on the bridge of a ship, let me tell you from direct experience, is no biggie these days, but back in 1988, it was quintessentially and uniquely Japanese. Something to look out for coming up way off in episode 6 is how Japanese Hawaii appears to be when the characters wander through it, but we'll get there when we get there. Just as a little joke here, the ticker tape LEDs on the bridge in this scene are flashing a defence condition number of 6 5/8. No one knows what that actually means. I'm guessing it is a reference to the share prices in Wall Street and similar financial institutions, rather than the realistic reflection of defence conditions on a starship. And so, as everybody gets ready for a battle with possible enemies, a little note on the use of the vehicles here. We see the Cosmo Attack 5, based on a vehicle from the Tokusatsu series Mighty Jack, being literally assembled in front of us. It doesn't have fold-down wings, it has actual unattached wings that are attached to it by robot arms, which makes sort of a point about advanced mechanisation in this future world, but is also, I think, a sly dig at model making and model makers. And we've seen before, and we'll see again in Gunbuster in episode 5, ships being assembled from what appear to be giant model kits. And model kits, of course, were the basis of the original business that would eventually turn into Gainax, because Gainax started out as a company called General Products, deriving their name, of course, from the company of the same name in the known space books of Larry Niven. But also they did a lot of business in scratch builds, which is taking a number of different model kits and shoving them together, or basically cloning parts to create different individualized creations. And while I've been talking, we've got a glimpse of the Excellion railway system, which has 4 different lines, with, as far as I can tell, stops every 750 metres or so in order to shunt crew members around the ship more effectively. I think it's interesting that Star Trek just has elevators, whereas a ship of this size actually has room and indeed a need for something more like an internal train system. Now, Noriko is off to the girls' locker room, but there's something much less frivolous to discuss coming up here, and that is the fate of Leaf 64. Leaf 64, by the way, being a name that crops up again in Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water, as a drug plant, a place to get drug plants. Anyway, Leaf 64 here is a star that the captain fondly remembers from his younger days, and this takes everybody by surprise. He says, I can only speculate, but the asides in the physics lectures and the overarching plot of Gunbuster tell us something that shouldn't be a spoiler to you if you're watching this commentary after seeing the series afresh, and that's the fact that these alien enemies are not aliens per se, but in reality the defense mechanism of the galaxy. In other words, humanity is a sort of plague on the face of the galaxy, and by advancing out into the cosmos, it has triggered the galactic equivalent of antibodies to try and wipe out the human race. And this is just a little aside here, but the location of Leaf 64 is in the Perseus Arm, which is where Noriko's father first encountered the aliens. So it's reasonable to assume that the monsters have been cultivated at the heart of Leaf 64 because it is believed that it is the location of the conflict. Of course, the true location ought to be the home system of humanity, but there is not yet any indication that the monsters know where that is. Big Sister in this scene, still doubting Noriko's ability, as well she might, as we've seen this girl do nothing but fall over since the thing started. And I think we can all agree that Big Sister has every right to doubt Noriko at this point. She's not being a cow or a bully, just an officer who would prefer to have a wingman who isn't going to get them both killed. Something to speculate about, for example, might be what would happen if humanity just never bothered to engage with the aliens, because if they're doing 99.8% light speed, it might well take them 16,000 years to even locate the Earth. So huge chunks of the plot of Gunbuster are really about fighting a war they could have waited longer to deal with. But of course by then there would have probably been overwhelming odds and everybody would have died. There are, incidentally, some hidden gags hidden among the robots for the launch bay. And you should look out for them now and hereafter, much like the kind of things that Vietnamese soldiers would paint on the side of their helmets. There's one that's got the Vanguard Ace logo on its calf, not in this point, but later on in the show. There's one with a sash advertising Shiseido Cosmetics. There's one with a crest on it that I'm sure will mean something to someone who's watched a zillion more giant robot shows than me. And we have a little scene set up as this bizarre little machine concession on the ship. Having been to a Japanese college, these little clusters of junk food vending machines are quite common. And I note with interest we never get to see more detailed descriptions of shipboard life, like, for example, the canteen. If a ship is 4 miles long and we know it has a space for a fake beach, there are surely other elements of shipboard life that have been glossed over in this show. So the voice of Smith Torin is actually provided by a Japanese actor called Kazuki Yao, whose real famous moment in the 1980s was playing Shinobu in Dan Kuga, better known today as the voice of Frankie in One Piece, and in Japan, the voice of Billy in the local dub of Adventure Time. His other claim to fame is that he supposedly dragged Eiichi Oda, the creator of One Piece, to so many gay bars that he eventually inspired the creation of the character of Bon Clay. How could I make this up? But his purpose here is to offer Noriko the false hope of becoming her new partner. It's never explained why Smith doesn't already have a partner, as he plainly has a bunch of colleagues and friends in the squad. But as he heads off to register them as partners, it seems that this is some sort of easy process that doesn't require the approval of their superiors. So I've just done a bit of jiggery pokery up and down this file, and I am here to report that the build-up to the battle scene, which we're in at the moment, takes over 5 minutes of the running time of this episode, whereas the battle itself turns into something of a non-event for Noriko, as she hardly gets a chance to do anything. And that's a masterful use of tension and pace from Hideaki Anno, which we would see him refine and reuse to good effect a few years later in Neon Genesis Evangelion. This is of course a structure that takes the longueurs of naval combat and extends them to a ridiculous degree. So we have a situation here where the fleet has been cognizant of the likely whereabouts of their enemy for the last 22 hours, but it's taken them this long to execute this manoeuvre and get themselves in position ready to actually fight them. Naval combat itself is often a foundation for the way that warfare is depicted in science fiction. Gunbuster wouldn't be the only sci-fi show in which ships are depicted as sinking or falling in an environment where only a gravity well would depict that. There are animators, of course, such as the much admired Yoshinori Kanada, who devote themselves to disrupting the expectations of two-dimensional close combat reenactions of sea battle in water and just putting them in space. But I think it's fair to say that huge chunks of Gunbuster are directly allegorical to the Japanese societal and military experience in World War II, and so it should come as no surprise that the battles we see end up being, very, very naval in their outlook. And as the music starts to swell into a pastiche of Gustav Holst's Jupiter, a little bit more about the composer Kohei Tanaka. I think I mentioned him last episode, but this is a man who's seen every angle of the music business because he worked in publicity for a music company and studied at the Berklee College of Music, and even ended up at one point playing the piano in a hotel bar before he was tapped as a composer for Japanese animation. And even though he's gone on to compose for Sakura Wars and One Piece, Gunbuster is arguably the second most remembered piece of his among anime fandom. I love it, I think it's a beautiful score, and all the more impressive for the way it follows the direction of the show itself. Tanaka has said in interviews that when he was first approached, he was only given the plot for the first 2 episodes. So what you have here in episode 3 is him desperately pivoting from what he thought was a parody to something far more serious and hard-hitting. And Tanaka has also said, I think with his tongue firmly in cheek, I don't think he was that serious, that Gunbuster was something of an embarrassment for him because of the number of tracks on it that were commissioned deliberately as pastiches of other composers. Holst, for example, Mozart and Dvorak most noticeably, but others too. And this is not something that bothers Yoko Kanno, who is always approached by producers and told to imitate various other composers. Nor indeed did it bother Tanaka when he wrote what has to be the most famous and also most loved of his compositions, the ending theme to Dragon Half. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google it, I'll wait. And he would of course be back for the sequel to Gunbuster, Diebuster, many years later, so it can't have bothered him that much. I will also say at this point there is a man called Pianite, whose real name I think is Yui Morishita, who recorded an absolutely beautiful piano sonata based on the music of Gunbuster back in 2011. And if you go to YouTube and type in Gunbuster Fantasy, you can hear it in all its glory. It's just a wonderful performance. Anyway, while I've been talking, we've been getting ready for the grand confrontation, which is over in seconds and is a fantastically well-conceived anticlimax. Because after all that training, and with the expectation, wholly justified, that we are going to see giant robot combat and spectacular moves and all kinds of anime-style action, Noriko is completely out of her depth in the face of these opponents. She doesn't have the chance to get off a single shot or land a single punch, and she, along with many other members of her squadron, as we eventually discover, is hopelessly outclassed. And Smith doesn't even get a heroic death. He just disappears from the radio and is never heard of again. It's such a nihilistic and realistic evocation of warfare, and is beautifully done here. It is also possibly inadvertently, evocative of many propaganda films made in Japan during the Pacific War, in the sense that you really don't get to see the enemy up close. The fact the Japanese were fighting Caucasians in the main and had a severe shortage of willing Caucasian actors to participate heavily incentivised the making of propaganda movies that found some sort of excuse not to show the enemy at all, or only to show their vehicles. So one of the big hits of wartime Japan was the movie The War at Sea from Hawaii to Malaya, which used early model work by the future special effects guru Eiji Tsuburaya. And of course, most famously, later in the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned Japan's first truly feature-length cartoon, Momotaro Sacred Sailors, although even that leaned on the participation of mystery and, as of yet unidentified, English-speaking voice actors in the final reel. Just for a moment, by the way, as we pan across the wreckage of the Tajion, sharp-eyed viewers may spot a toilet seat among the debris out there in space. The Tajion, by the way, reminds me of Tarshion, which is the name of the Martian invaders in Makoto Shinkai's Voices of a Distant Star, one of the later anime that would pay the most obvious homage to Gunbuster. Ironically, of course, many of the very young people who enthused over Voices of a Distant Star and its use of time dilation as a metaphor for the emotional distance between people had never even heard of Gunbuster. But the fact is that despite the huge love for it in many sectors of fandom, Gunbuster itself remains a relatively obscure title, a fact which I hope will be changed forever by its long-awaited and long-delayed release on Blu-ray. In fact, in the late 20th century, when I first began writing about anime in earnest, I would often allude to Gunbuster in articles, only for Japanese people to tell me they had no idea what I was talking about. Gunbuster's footprint among fandom and its standing among critics is something that's burned very slowly over the years, and I really think it's only now, with the ongoing success of Evangelion and the availability of digital media that allow us to fully appraise it, is it really getting its due. Absolute silence now as Noriko dawdles home, because nobody, least of all her, has got anything to say. But then the soundtrack here starts up with Kanashimi, or Sorrow, which is one of the banked tracks on the Gunbuster score. You hear it several times in the anime, most memorably, I think, in episode 6, when Gunbuster is descending within Jupiter on what is liable to be a one-way mission. And it's one of the most evocative pieces on an already evocative soundtrack. And I have to say, when I'm watching Gunbuster to do this commentary, it is of course playing on the other side of the room with the sound turned off, so I don't get to hear Kohei Tanaka's music in place where it really should be. And it makes it very clear to me, as if I didn't know already, just how fantastic the music for Gunbuster really is. Key animation in this episode, as in episode 2, was by Yuji Moriyama, a stalwart of 1980s anime, and I think you can really see that in these scenes, in the organic, hand-drawn feel of Noriko and her grief. Of course, all anime is hand-drawn at some point in the process or other, but within 10 years of Gunbuster being made, it was being hand-drawn in a computer, and often animated in a computer, and so you lose a degree of that almost haptic sense of human hands creating this artwork and making it move. And here we have Noriko announcing that it is the trauma of losing Smith, of not being there for him, that makes her want to break that barrier and truly be the best that she can be. But we're going to cut from her grief and her resolve to a bank shot of the Exelion in ether space to something all new, which is a close-up view of the monsters in their natural habitat, a sudden revelation about the space terrible monsters. Creatures born in the hearts of young suns at the galactic core and spreading out to deal with infections to the galaxy, which is to say the sudden and unpredicted rise of humanity on the outlying galactic arm. And these are shots here of a creature being born in a sun, and they're not using digital distortion because that's not yet a thing in the anime world. If I'm not mistaken, they're using something called Nami glass or wave glass, which is a glass plate which thickens and then thins again, which you can push across an animated still in order to make it appear to pulse and distort. One of those old analog techniques that the anime business has now almost lost 3 decades later, when it's more likely to be done digitally. And then we cut back to that preppy little outro, Try Again, again sung by Noriko Sakai, looking increasingly out of place in a series that started off being about schoolgirl rivalry and now is about humanity's hopeless place in the universe, facing impossible odds against monsters born in the hearts of dying suns. So, that escalated quickly. And about time too, because after that tantalising glimpse of Gunbuster's head in that final scene on the ship, the next episode is our chance to see Gunbuster go into action for the first time in the launch of the unfinished ultimate weapon. No flipping now. No flipping.
お星様に消えた私の初恋。でも悲しんでばかりじゃいられないわ。コーチ、私をもっとしごいてください。辛くて苦しい特訓の日々。ノリコ、ファイト。悪い宇宙怪獣を太陽系に近づけるな。でもエクセリオンがやられてしまう。パパ、スミス、ノリコに力を貸して。人の命は尽きるとも不滅の力、バスターマシーン。動け、ガンバスター。みんなの地球を守って。次回トップを狙え第4話、発進未完の最終兵器に稲妻キック。